Hey, happy St. Patrick's Day. Here in the Bay Area, we are under this shelter in place order. And because of that, I wanted to touch base with you on more than just a Sunday morning worship time and just give you a little bit of encouragement during the week here. And I would encourage you to do the same. Go ahead and contact some people from your church family or from your small group. You can even do it in a small or a fun way. I was yesterday playing some phone games with Ryland Mail, and that was a good way for us to just stay in touch for about 20 or 30 minutes. I promised mom and dad it was no more than that. Keep on thinking about your ones and your neighbors. How could you encourage them right now, given with all the stuff that's going on around us? What would be helpful to them? Do they need help with some food? Getting food delivered to them? Do they need help with some yard work? Would they have any child care concerns or challenges? You might not know if you don't ask. And so I am encouraging you to ask. So, why March 17 for St. Patrick's Day? Well, that's the day that is assigned to his death. And he was a really important figure. If you didn't know it, I'm a bit of a fan of St. Patrick. Not necessarily so much of the day and a lot of what it has become over time, but I am a fan of the man himself. At the Walnut Creek Church of Christ, if you go there, you already know this, but if not, I'll tell you, we had just recently begun a study before we had to go to these sort of cyber church services here. We started looking at the story of Joseph in the book of Genesis, which is the first book in the Old Testament. You might hear my dog in the background here. But we're looking at the life of Joseph. And we were barely into Joseph's story when we saw Joseph. He got sold as a slave when he was 17 years old. Well, something very similar happened to Patrick. In the early 400s, he was growing up in Romanized England. He was abducted by Irish slavers, pirates, and taken to Ireland when he was 16. He was forced to live outside and take care of sheep for his enslavers. And because of that, he was afforded a great deal of time to pray. Patrick would say that he knew who Jesus was prior to his abduction. His grandfather was actually a priest, but he just kind of blew it off. He was 16 and he didn't really take it very seriously. He wasn't very reflective about that. But because of his enslavement and this extended isolation that he would have because of his particular task as a slave, he had a tremendous amount of time to be in prayer. And it was during that time that he would say that he truly began to offer his life to Jesus and to care about him and the things that he cared about. Well, after about 6 years of captivity, Patrick felt led by God to escape. He actually says he had some visions, and one of those was that his ship was ready. And so he walked about 200 miles across part of Ireland to this coastal village where there was a ship, and he eventually talked his way on to getting on board. He attributes it to a lot of prayer because initially they weren't going to let him on. And this ship headed back to mainland Europe. It was probably Gaul, or what would be modern day France, where they landed. So he eventually, though, gets back home to England, and he committed himself for a season to a lot of more formal study of the Bible. He actually memorized the Latin Bible. Well, eventually, he felt led by God to return to the very people who had enslaved him with this good news of Jesus. And so somewhere in his mid-40s, Patrick got on a boat and set sail back to Ireland, to the very people who had enslaved him. When it was all said and done, some historians say that Patrick baptized upwards of 100,000 people in Ireland. Later in his life, it would kind of seem that he would make apologies for his lack of eloquence. He would look at other seminarians and religious leaders, and they seemed to have better educations and better oratory skills, and he was humbled by that. And that might be one of the reasons why we only have a few of his writings. There's really two that we have that everyone is fairly much in agreement that this is directly from Patrick. One is a letter that he writes to a Briton named Coroticus, who is doing what was done to him early in his life. Coroticus is going and taking Irish people as slaves back to England. And so Patrick writes a letter to him and to England in general to kind of get them to practice social isolation from Coroticus in order to get him to change his behavior. He also writes his confession. And if you get a chance this week, since it is St. Patrick's Day, look online and read the confession of St. Patrick. And I think after you read through that, you might be a little bit of a fan of his as well. So in the spirit of St. Patrick, I will close by reading, it's an abbreviated writing that's attributed to St. Patrick. There's some debate about whether he actually penned this or not, but he is certainly at least the inspiration of it. You first start seeing it about in the 7th or 8th century, and it's called the Shield of St. Patrick, or some might call it the Call of the Deer. I bind unto myself today the strong name of the Trinity, by invocation of the same, the three in one, the one in three. I bind this day to me forever, by power of faith, Christ's incarnation, his baptism in the Jordan River, his death on the cross for my salvation, his bursting from the spiced tomb, his riding up the heavenly way, his coming at the day of doom. I bind unto myself today. I bind unto myself today the power of God to hold and lead, his eye to watch, his might to say, his ear to hearken to my need, the wisdom of my God to teach, his hand to guide, his shield to ward, the word of God to give me speech, his heavenly host to be my guard. Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in hearts of all that love me, Christ in mouth of friend and stranger. I bind unto myself the name, the strong name of the Trinity, by invocation of the same, the three in one, the one in three, of whom all nature hath creation, eternal Father, Spirit, Word. Praise to the God of my salvation. Salvation is of Christ the Lord. I hope you're encouraged by St. Patrick's life, by some of his words here, especially given the time of isolation that we find ourselves in here and the challenges that are going on around us. Be encouraged.